Hello. I want to take this chance to give a little bit of analysis on the Kakhovka dam damage. It's been a day now since it's happened, and Simplicius, the thinker, has put out another great article on Substack. A link to Simplicius's Substack is in the description. Please go and check it out. But I want to go through some of the points raised there and some other points around who may have caused this, what may have caused the dam to fail. So let's just start with some of the points that have been raised that would indicate that perhaps the Ukrainians have caused this this dam to fail now. Now, one of the reasons raised is that it could provide them with some sort of an excuse or an ability to delay further offensive activity if they were felt to have been suffering over the last couple of days. So if you do believe the Russian reports, over the last couple of days, the Ukrainians have mounted some offensives in the southern Donbass area, near Avdiivka and Marinka and Bakhmut, through this area here. And reportedly the losses for the Ukrainians have been quite high for a 2-day period. There's talks of upwards of 1,500 men being lost, of 28 tanks being lost, of 100 or more smaller armoured vehicles, including the French AMX 10RC wheeled tanks. So if this is the case, then yes, it seems like it could be reasonable that perhaps the Ukrainians have said, hey, we need to have a breather, we'll blow the dam, we'll let the water flow down through the Kherson region and take some sort of benefit out of that. One idea. Ukraine have got some previous history here. So last November, the Washington Post released an article where they have quoted a Ukrainian commander as describing that they had actually fired a HIMARS missile at the dam to be able to test what damage they could do in case they did want to blow this dam in the future. There's a Washington Times, not Washington Post, Washington Times article titled "Inside the Ukrainian Counteroffensive That Shocked Putin and Reshaped the War." Within this article, they quoted a former commander of the Kherson counteroffensive, Major General Andrey Kovalchuk, who admitted to planning this attack. The Ukrainians, he said, even conducted a test strike with a HIMARS launcher on one of the floodgates at the Kakhovka Dam, making 3 holes in the metal to see if the Dnieper's water could be raised enough to stymie Russian crossings downstream, but not flood nearby villages. Now, as it turned out at the time, they didn't proceed. They didn't go further, but it's admitted here by the Ukrainian Major General that they did launch a HIMARS strike on the dam to test it. Obviously, another reason that would seem to indicate that the Ukrainians may have caused this to occur now is that downstream of the reservoir and the dam wall, there were Russian positions on the eastern side of the Dnieper River. Now, the area that the Russians were positioned in there are now considered to be well under floodwaters. So these areas were populated by the Russian forces. They had allegedly mined some of these areas on the riverbanks so as to slow down any Ukrainian amphibious assault that may come across the river. And so the thinking is that these floodwaters may have washed these minefields away, and now, once the waters recede, provide an easier approach for the Ukrainians to get across the Dnieper and get onto the eastern side of the Dnieper and to begin to try to break through Russian positions. I guess another point is that claiming this as being caused by the Russians allows the Ukrainians a PR victory at this stage. Again, if they have just suffered some heavy losses in the last 2 days in what many people are calling the start of the Ukrainian offensive, which has been long touted as coming, being a spring offensive and now summer offensive, while others are claiming that what's happening in the last few days isn't the offensive, but is just some psyops, some softening attacks, some things to draw Russian troops to different areas, basically doing some switching around and dummying to try to throw the Russians off balance, and then strike once the Ukrainians find an area the Russians have left undefended. But if it was, then this again, by claiming the Russians have done this on the global stage with the Western media, gives the Ukrainians some ability to perhaps gain the PR upper hand for a little while. Another reason why this could be Ukrainian caused is that the reservoir behind the dam wall feeds the North Crimean Canal. And the North Crimean Canal, as it sounds, is a water canal which feeds water down into the Crimea. Now, this had been turned off or blocked in 2014 by the Ukrainians when the initial Ukrainian conflict began, and the canal was reopened last year in 2022 by the Russians when they assumed control of this area. So the Russians have held control since last year over the Kakhovka reservoir and the dam and the related areas to the east, or on the eastern side of the river. So if the Ukrainians had caused this to happen, if water supply now decreases to Crimea, then you would expect mount political pressure upon Moscow, which might be the Ukrainian desire. This emptying out of the reservoir, once the reservoir has emptied, could then decrease the river levels of the Dnieper River near Kherson, which may then make an amphibious crossing for the Ukrainians an easier task, as they do need to get across the river to make an advance down towards the Sea of Azov and get down and cut the land bridge to Crimea. So if that is their goal, then perhaps by blowing the bridge and letting the water out now, once all of the water has drained out, they have a smaller amphibious crossing to make. So these are some of the reasons where you could or being suggested as to why the Ukrainians may have caused this. And the Ukrainians are certainly suggesting that the Russians have caused this. Now, one counter argument to the Russians having caused this is that if the Russians had wanted to cause this flooding to perhaps wipe out some Ukrainian positions downstream, then they could simply have opened the gates rather than destroying the bridge, as the Russians had forces there controlling the Kakhovka Hydro Electric Plant and the floodgates. It would seem to be perhaps a more realistic approach that if the Russians had wanted to produce some flooding, they could have opened the floodgates for a period of time, let water through, cause flooding, cause some problem for the Ukrainian forces downstream, have alerted their Russian forces on the eastern side of the Dnieper to pull back in advance of any flooding, and then stop the water flow, let water build up for another month or so, and perhaps perform this again. Or perhaps they would have waited until more of the Ukrainian forces had crossed the Dnieper and then caused this to happen, which would then have cut those forces off, cut them from their supply lines, and forcing them into a much larger amphibious crossing to get back home again. So for these reasons, perhaps unlikely that the Russians have caused this at this time. But if we look at then at why the Russians may have caused this, how would they benefit from this? Well, in the same way that the Ukrainians would benefit by flooding Russian positions downstream from the reservoir, the Russians would benefit from flooding some of the islands in the Dnieper River just downstream to the southwest of Kherson. The Russians were allegedly struggling with Ukrainian forces who had been getting themselves in and out of a number of these islands and were using these as forward bases to set up drone repeaters and drone radio relays to allow them to extend the range of their drones from the western side of the Dnieper by putting these repeaters out further into the river on some of these islands, getting them range to be able to allow them to travel or to send their drones further into the Russian-controlled territory. So for this reason, it may be that the Russians would like to have stopped the Ukrainians from doing that by flooding this area. Another interesting point that Simplicius brings up on his recent post is that the Russians may have done this in order to help them with their plans to perhaps recapture Odessa and link up with the Russian forces who are on the west of Odessa in Transnistria. Now, while this does make some sense, that if you were going to advance across the Dnieper, if the Russians were going across the Dnieper to the western side of the Dnieper, that they would not want the threat of the Ukrainians blowing this dam and then leaving them stranded. They would not want to have that threat behind them while they were maneuvering over the Dnieper River. So this does make sense. And that could have been a benefit for the Russians to have blown this now, so that when they come to move and want to go across the Dnieper and get to Odessa and Transnistria, they can do that without this fear. However, there's a couple of counter-arguments to that too. One would be the timing. If the Russians knew that this was going to be problematic by flooding, then again, perhaps they would have blown this closer or just before or just after they had actually crossed the Dnieper and dealt with it in a period of time that they controlled. So not just after, but done it before, just before they crossed over the Dnieper. Also, as I stated before, because they would have been aware of the trouble this could cause, it seems like in some respects it's an asset that they may wish to have held on to longer and used once or twice by controlling the floodgates to cause trouble for the Ukrainians whenever they made an offensive advance. Also, another counter-argument to this is that there are another 5 dams further higher upstream which the Ukrainians control. So once this, if the Russians had blown and destroyed this dam, then their control over that dam is lost. And the Ukrainians could, in theory, then open all of the floodgates up above and still cause a flooding to occur, which could have trapped the Russians while they're on their way to Odessa and on the other side of the Dnieper. I guess the last point here is the possibility of this being natural causes or semi-natural causes. And the idea here is that the bridge itself was perhaps not the bridge, the dam itself, and the facilities were not well maintained over the last few years because of the conflict that's been going on. And that the increasing water levels in the Kakhovka reservoir were pushing the dam wall to its limits. So while this isn't being admitted in a great deal in the Ukrainian Telegram channels and social media, but there is evidence and monitoring from third parties, independent parties, showing that the water levels since April of 2023 in the reservoir have risen to levels higher than they have been for a year, for some time, getting up over 17 meters of height, which has been pushing the capacity of the dam to its limits. So there's that possibility. There's also another possibility of why the Ukrainians may have wished to engage in doing this, is that because the Russians controlled the Kakhovka Hydro Electric Power Plant and were generating power from that power plant and using that power on their Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine, the loss of the ability to do that now is going to put more political pressure on the Russians and on Moscow, and that's something which the Ukrainians would definitely be looking to achieve. So look, at this stage, who knows? There are other theories as well that the reservoir was perhaps mined on perhaps the Russian side, mined on the Ukrainian side, so as to stop each army from advancing across, and that some of these sea mines may have worked their way loose. And one of these striking the wall, or a number of these striking the wall, may have caused damage. There's certainly footage now coming out which seems to indicate that perhaps shelling is continuing of the dam wall. Now, there have been reports of the Ukrainians shelling the wall before. We know they've had a HIMARS strike on there, but also shelling going on. The video does seem to show explosions in the water. There's sound with some of these videos, and they don't seem to indicate or have sound of the whistling that you would expect of a shell incoming or a mortar incoming. So again, Simplicius is thinking that maybe these explosions that you can see occurring, and which are occurring after the dam has been breached, may in fact be sea mines who are floating down and now colliding with areas of the dam. Anyhow, I guess we'll see what will happen. Stay tuned. Please subscribe for more updates.